Imagine you're growing up in the 1950s, and you go to the movies on Saturday for 10 cents. You get to watch maybe some sort of cowboy serial film that each week leaves you with a cliffhanger, and then you just can't wait to get to the cinema next week to see what happens to the Lone Ranger or to his sidekick Tonto. And week in and week out, you religiously go to the theater. You take your 10 cents to watch the movie. You take your 5 cents for a popcorn and 5 cents for a soda, and you just are enthralled with the cinema. That is really the generation of filmmakers that grows up with the cinema in the 50s, goes to college in the 60s and 70s, and are excited about movies. And like I mentioned, some of these filmmakers, Spielberg, Lucas, Coppola, De Palma, they all grew up with this golden era of filmmaking. They watched the big classics, they saw the serial movies, and they wanted to make movies like that. And that's really what motivated a lot of these film school students. Now, some of them wanted to deal with darker subjects. Martin Scorsese, growing up in New York, seeing the streets of New York and perhaps different elements that people in Southern California didn't grow up with. Or even, George Lucas growing up in Northern California, Steven Spielberg growing up in Arizona, out here in the West, they had a different experience. So obviously you're going to reflect different things, but nonetheless, they all were influenced by American cinema. Then as they go to the film school, they get exposed to European filmmakers, particularly the French New Wave, and they start to see a bigger picture of filmmaking, and they absorb it all. They see, we didn't even get to touch about this, but some of the German films that are very impressionistic, and the way that the camera angles are so strong and bold, and even some of the dark subjects that they dealt with, they absorb all of it, and I really believe go out to make movies that will be uniquely American, but yet influenced by so many different sources. You talk to George Lucas and Steven Spielberg when they had the idea to make Raiders of the Lost Ark. Really what they wanted to do was make a movie that excited them the way that the old serial films of the 1950s that they watched growing up as boys in the local theater. And that was the inspiration for Raiders of the Lost Ark. And Spielberg and making Jaws and Close Encounters and E.T. I wanted to make movies that were adventurous and yet still had a positive message. And really, when you look at this generation of filmmakers, a lot of them still had a bit of hope at the end of their films. Not all the films did, but as we look at the culture of America in the late 60s with the Vietnam War and on to the 70s with Watergate and a recession and high prices and gas lines, and there's a lot going on within the culture of America. There's a lot going on within our society that is dark and depressing. And so even though Jaws is quite the horror flick, if you will, if you compare it to a slasher movie, doesn't come anywhere near. It's not that gory. It's more of a psychological thriller. There is a bit of adventure, actually a lot of adventure, and I'm not going to spoil the movie for you, but there's a positive ending. Even though there's few people that die in the movie, it does end with a positive note. It does give us a bit of a silver lining. And you think about movies like Jaws and Star Wars, and even Close Encounters, and some of these movies that came out in the mid to late 70s, they start to offer a little bit more hope than some of the darker movies of maybe perhaps a little bit older film school generation, like the Francis Ford Coppola's with The Godfather, Martin Scorsese with Mean Streets. You can kind of see two different, I guess, frame of views, and it really depends on the person's personality. The whole point that I want you to see, and I'd like you to investigate perhaps a little bit as you take a look at Chapter 20, is that this is a very intelligent group of men And I say men because at this time it still is somewhat rare to come across a woman. That will come later a bit in the 80s and definitely in the 90s. But these guys have been exposed to so much, and they've seen cinema, they've breathed cinema, they live cinema, and they're really able to take it all in and then regurgitate it in a way that would become fresh and new and exciting and kind of breathe life into Hollywood again. They do it on two different levels. I mentioned The Godfather. Francis Ford Coppola, this is a big blockbuster for him, and I don't mean that it made hundreds of millions of dollars, but it definitely was a success. I mean, it won Best Picture in 1973. I believe it was 73. You can double check me, but I believe it was 73. Might have been 72. Anyways, this put him on the map, even though he had won a Best Screenwriting Oscar for Patton and had directed a couple other movies before that. The Godfather put him on the map. But I mean, if you watch it, I enjoy the movie, but it's dark. It doesn't necessarily have the most hopeful of endings. But the idea of Hollywood being able to be successful monetarily again is interesting, because by the 60s, it is really not doing too well. Hollywood really starts to fail. And a lot of that is because of old formulas don't work anymore. Society has changed, and the culture demanded a different type of movie that wasn't being offered to them. And so by the late 60s, when a lot of these movies are coming out, even Easy Rider, you start to see that there's an interest, but it needs to be a different type of movie. And by the mid-70s, you do have, like I said, the guys like Spielberg and Lucas who come out with movies that offer a little bit more hope, and these movies are successful. Jaws becomes the first blockbuster movie by a true definition. It makes over $100 million. People line up around the block waiting at the movie theater to get in. And it becomes not just a successful movie, but a cultural phenomenon. I mean, I remember being a little boy. I was born in 1972. And I remember some of my first thoughts of being in the water, and whether it was a swimming pool or the ocean, was, I hope a shark doesn't come in here. I was frightened of it. I never saw the movie. I didn't see the movie till I was a teenager, really. But I was scared to death of sharks because people talked about it. It was on TV commercials. My cousins even had a game where you had the shark and you tried to get something out of his mouth. If you touched his tooth, it snapped down on you. It's frightening. But Jaws was more than just a scary movie. If we take a look at its subject matter closely as you watch it, it definitely reflects its era. Look to see the relationship between the politicians and the police, the politicians and the community. You definitely see a lot of that being reflected in the movie. But like I said, getting back to it, it was a huge blockbuster, and it really set kind of a standard for the next 30 or so years of summer movies. The summertime was not seen as necessarily a time to launch a big movie and to have everybody go and see that movie. And really, from 1975 and on, there was understanding that teenagers had more disposable income, and that they were going to make movies that would be more geared towards them or a younger mind, people in college and so forth, and that they could be a driving force to come to the theater, spend their money, and make these movies successful. So the summertime became really a platform to launch some of these real big blockbuster movies, and you can see it from 1975 on. You see Jaws, you see Star Wars, and a few years later you see Raiders of the Lost Ark, you see E.T., and so forth. I mean, we can't think of the summertime without thinking about what big movies are coming out this summer. All right, we'll come back in Section 3 and wrap this all up.